5 years. That's how long Nyla Smith held her breath, scrubbing marble floors to remain completely invisible, living in constant terror, working as a lowly maid under the roof of the one man she was desperately hiding from. Kang Min-Sung, the ruthless Korean Mafia boss, and the father of her secret child. But this isn't just a story about a woman hiding from a monster. It's about what happened when Min-Sung made one critical mistake. He underestimated the quiet maid, and he failed to realize that the little boy hiding behind her apron possessed the exact same piercing gaze as his own. What should have been a deadly execution for her deception became the spark of a bloody syndicate war, and a dark, twisted path to redemption. Because Nyla didn't just survive his obsessive wrath. She dropped her subservient facade, outsmarted rival factions, and challenged his absolute control. And when the smoke cleared, the invisible maid didn't just escape the Mafia. She ruled it, forcing a ruthless killer to finally fight for his humanity. This is the story of the greatest deception that forged the ultimate syndicate queen. And trust me, you won't believe what happens next. The grand hallway plunged into a suffocating silence as Kang Min-Sung stopped dead in his tracks, his eyes locking onto the terrified little boy for the very first time. The crystal chandelier above cast fractured light across the marble floor, illuminating the exact moment Nyla's carefully constructed world shattered. For 5 years, she had perfected the art of being a ghost. She kept her gaze fixed on the baseboards, her voice a soft, submissive whisper, and her uniform impeccably ironed to blend in with the walls of the Kang estate. It was a suffocating cage of compliance, but it was the only way to keep Adrian safe from the violence that ruled Kang Min-Sung's empire. But now the ghost was seen. Min-Sung stood motionless, a towering figure of lethal grace in his bespoke suit. The murmurs of his heavily armed lieutenants down the hall faded into a dull buzz in Nyla's ears. All she could hear was the frantic, deafening drumbeat of her own heart. Adrian, usually so adept at staying hidden in the servants' corridors, had chased a stray marble straight into the lion's den. The Mafia boss didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't summon his guards to drag her away. He simply stared. His dark, piercing eyes that had ordered the eradication of entire rival syndicates without a single flicker of emotion, were locked onto the 5-year-old boy. Adrian blinked up at him, innocent and confused, his tiny fists instinctively clutching the fabric of Nyla's apron. The boy possessed the same sharp jawline, the same thick, midnight black hair, and the exact same intense, soul-stripping stare. It was a living, breathing mirror reflecting a dangerous past Min-Sung thought he had burned to the ground. Nyla dropped to her knees, breaking every rule of the invisible maid. She threw her arms around Adrian, desperately pressing his face into her shoulder to sever the connection between father and son. "I'm sorry, sir," she choked out, her voice trembling as the subservient mask she had worn for half a decade violently cracked. "He got lost. We'll leave immediately. Look at me." The command was softly spoken, yet it resonated with a terrifying, absolute authority. It wasn't the voice of a master reprimanding a careless servant. It was the voice of a man unearthing a staggering deception. Slowly, agonizingly, Nyla lifted her head. For the first time in 5 years, she met Kang Min-Sung's gaze not as his nameless employee, but as the fiercely intelligent woman who had once survived his bed, stolen his heir, and vanished into the shadows of his own home. He took a slow, deliberate step forward, the polished leather of his shoe echoing like a gunshot in the silent hall. The cold, calculated monster the underworld feared was visibly warring with something deeper, darker, and infinitely more obsessive. He didn't just want answers for her betrayal. Staring at the trembling woman and the son he never knew existed, a violent, redeeming pull toward a family he never knew he craved locked its jaws around his dark heart. The era of her invisibility was over. The air in the grand hallway grew thick, heavy with the suffocating weight of a 5-year lie. Min-Sung closed the distance between them with the predatory, unhurried grace of a man who owned the world and everything in it. Nyla's breath hitched. She instinctively pulled Adrian tighter against her chest, her small frame acting as a useless human shield against a mobster who could level cities with a single command. "How long?" Min-Sung's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it vibrated through the cold marble floor, settling deep in Nyla's bones. It was the same dark velvet cadence that had lured her into his bed half a decade ago, back when she was just a naive girl addicted to playing with fire. Now that fire threatened to completely consume her son. "I don't know what you mean, Mr. Kang," Nyla lied, her voice shaking, but her chin tilted up just a fraction. A dangerous spark of the fierce, intelligent woman she had buried alive flickered in her dark, tear-filled eyes. He's just my son. Please let us go back to the quarters. Min-Sung didn't blink. He reached down, his large, calloused hand, a hand that dealt relentlessly in death, hovering mere inches from Adrian's cheek. Nyla flinched, preparing for violence, but the boy didn't. Adrian stared back at the towering Mafia boss with an eerie, quiet defiance that was entirely Kang. A lie only survives if no one is looking. Nyla, Min-Sung murmured, speaking her actual name for the first time in years. The sound of it falling from his lips sent a treacherous shiver down her spine, a lethal, confusing mix of pure terror and an old, unwanted heat. I am looking now. And I see myself. His fingers lightly brushed the boy's dark curls, a gesture incredibly gentle for a man made of brutality. The stark contrast made Nyla's stomach twist into knots. This wasn't the explosive, murderous rage she had spent 5 years anticipating. This was an obsessive, territorial realization. The truth had clawed its way out of the dark, and Min-Sung was staking his claim. He is mine, Min-Sung stated. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a terrifying decree. No, Nyla fired back, the word tearing from her throat before she could swallow it. The subservient maid vanished completely, replaced by a mother cornered by a wolf. He is mine. You don't get to have him. You don't get to drag him into your blood and your wars. Min-Sung's piercing gaze snapped from the boy to her. The dangerous stillness in his eyes fractured, replaced by a dark, possessive storm. The air between them crackled with an undeniable, volatile attraction that 5 years of scrubbing floors hadn't managed to kill. He leaned in close, the intoxicating scent of expensive cologne and faint gunpowder invading her senses. You hid my air in my own house, he whispered, his face inches from hers, radiating an inescapable gravity. You played a very dangerous game. But the hiding is over. You belong to me. Both of you. Min-Sung didn't wait for her permission. He never had. With a subtle flick of his wrist, the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall swung shut, sealing off the murmuring lieutenants and plunging the corridor into an intimate, suffocating silence. Nyla remained on her knees on the cold marble, her arms still locked around Adrian. She was painfully aware of the crushing power imbalance. She was a maid in a cotton uniform, and he was the undisputed king of a blood-soaked empire. Stand up, Nyla. The moment they stepped into the sprawling, dimly lit suite, Min-Sung set Adrian down on a plush velvet sofa. He immediately pulled a phone from his tailored pocket, his voice dropping to a lethal, clipped baritone as he barked orders to his lieutenants. Lock down the estate. No one enters. No one leaves. Double the perimeter guard. He paused, his dark eyes snapping to Nyla, tracking her every breath as if she might vanish into thin air again. If anyone speaks of the boy, cut out their tongue. Nyla shivered, wrapping her arms around herself. The chilling directive was meant as a shield, but it felt exactly like a shackle. This was the terrifying paradox of the man she had run from. His protection was indistinguishable from his obsession. He was mobilizing an army to keep them safe, but he was also building a fortress they would never be allowed to leave. He ended the call and crossed the room, stopping mere inches from her. The intoxicating, dangerous heat of his body enveloped her once again. He reached out, his thumb slowly tracing the trembling line of her jaw. It was a touch that burned with 5 years of starved, unspoken hunger. You look at me and see a monster, he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips before rising to meet her terrified, defiant eyes. You think I am locking you away to punish you for your deception. But out there they will use him to break me. They will use you to destroy him. His hand slid to the nape of her neck, a heavy possessive grip that anchored her completely to him. I do not protect what is mine with soft words, Nyla. I protect it with violence. Staring into the pitch-black abyss of his eyes, she finally understood. He wasn't just offering sanctuary. He was offering a dark, consuming devotion. To survive the coming storm, she would have to let the monster hold them close. The heavy silence in the penthouse pressed against Nyla, but the frantic trembling in her limbs finally ceased. For 5 years her survival had depended on making herself small, shrinking into the corners of his sprawling estate to avoid the predatory gaze of Kang Min-Sung. But as his large, calloused hand rested possessively on the nape of her neck, The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Shrinking had only delayed the inevitable. She took a deliberate step backward, forcing his hand to drop. The sudden absence of his burning touch left the air between them violently cold, but Nyla didn't flinch. Instead, her hands moved to the crisp white apron tied tightly around her waist. With a sharp, sudden tug, she snapped the strings. The fabric fluttered to the plush carpet. A white flag of surrender to the past, but a fierce declaration of war for the future. Min-Sung's eyes darkened, instantly tracking the movement. The dangerous stillness returned to his posture, his jaw tightening as he watched her shed the disguise that had successfully blinded him for half a decade. "I am not your servant anymore," Nyla said. Her voice, conditioned for years to be a breathy, submissive whisper, rang out clear and steady in the cavernous room. She met his piercing, obsidian stare head-on, refusing to lower her chin. "And I am not your prisoner. You do not get to decree my fate, as if I am just another piece of your syndicate." A lethal, unpredictable tension crackled in the narrow space between them. For a terrifying second, she thought he might summon his guards to teach her a brutal lesson in compliance. He was a mafia boss accustomed to absolute obedience. Men had been buried in the foundations of the city for showing far less defiance. Instead, a slow predatory smirk curved the corner of Min-Sung's mouth. It was a terrifying expression, one that promised both absolute ruin and dark worship. He stepped directly over the discarded apron, closing the distance until the tips of his polished shoes touched her worn black flats. "There she is," he murmured, the velvet timbre of his voice vibrating with a dark, intoxicating thrill. The woman who was clever enough to steal from a king and vanish into his own shadows. He reached out, but this time he didn't restrain her. His knuckles gently grazed her cheekbone, a gesture of lethal reverence that made her breath hitch. "I don't want a ghost, Nyla," Min-Sung stated, his gaze dropping to her lips with a devastating, starved hunger. "I want the woman who outsmarted the devil. If you want to protect our son, you will have to stop hiding and stand in the light. Tell me your terms." Her heart hammered against her ribs, but the suffocating fear was gone, replaced by a fierce, adrenaline-fueled power. She had spent 5 years burying her narrative. Now, standing toe-to-toe with the city's most dangerous man, she was finally going to write it. The air between them hummed with the heavy, suffocating ghosts of 5 years ago. Nyla looked into Min-Sung's obsidian eyes and was instantly dragged back to the nights she had spent trying to forget. Their affair had never been a mere transaction of power. It had been a dangerous, consuming fire. In the dead of night, hidden away from the syndicate's prying eyes, they had stripped away his ruthless mafia armor and her quiet servitude, colliding in a desperate need that defied the rules of his dark world. "My terms." Nyla's voice trembled slightly, but she planted her feet, refusing to break his gaze. "My terms are that Adrian survives your empire." Min-Sung's jaw clenched. The memory of her sudden, inexplicable disappearance hung between them like a drawn blade. "You ran," he stated, the velvet timbre of his voice laced with a quiet, lethal bitterness. "You took what was mine, erased yourself, and hid in the walls of my own home. You let me believe the only woman who ever saw past the monster had simply abandoned me." "I ran because your world is a graveyard, Min-Sung," she fired back, using his given name for the first time in half a decade. The sound of his name on her lips made his eyes flash with a sudden, possessive heat, but Nyla pushed forward, her chest heaving. "Do you remember the night I left? The Russian faction sent hitmen into your private study. I watched you wash their blood off your hands before you came to my bed. How was I supposed to tell you I was carrying your child? How could I sentence an innocent baby to a life with a target on his back?" The raw truth hit him, a stark, violent reminder of the bloodshed that forever stalked his shadow. He hadn't just lost a lover. His own ruthless reality had driven her into hiding. Min-Sung's gaze shifted briefly to Adrian, who was now fast asleep on the plush velvet sofa, blissfully oblivious to the syndicate war his mere existence had just ignited. The mafia boss's expression softened by a fraction of a millimeter, a dangerous vulnerability that belonged only to her. "The past you tried to escape has already caught up with us, Nyla," Min-Sung warned, his tone dropping to a low, deadly register. He closed the remaining gap between them, his towering frame crowding her space. The lieutenants in the hallway saw him. "In my world, an unknown heir isn't a secret for long. It is a weakness. The rival families will not see an innocent boy. They will see a weapon to bleed me dry. He reached out, his thumb gently but firmly tracing the curve of her lower lip. You hid to save him from my past. But now the only way he survives our future is if you stop running, and let the monster you fear burn the world down to protect you. The promise of the world burning wasn't a comfort. It was a cage. Min-Sung's thumb still hovered near her mouth, the heat of his skin a dangerous temptation, but Nyla forced herself to step back. The sudden distance between them felt colder, yet infinitely necessary. She refused to trade the invisible prison of a maid's uniform for the gilded cage of a mafia boss's obsession. Burning the world down leaves nothing but ashes, Min-Sung, Nyla said, her voice steadying into a blade of quiet defiance. And I refused to raise my son in a wasteland. Min-Sung's hand dropped slowly to his side. The lethal stillness returned to his posture, his dark eyes narrowing as he assessed the woman before him. For years men had cowered at his feet, begging for the very protection he was freely offering her. Yet here she stood, a former maid with nothing but her fierce intelligence, looking the devil in the eye and rejecting his terms. You think you have a choice? He challenged, his baritone voice dropping to a silken, terrifying threat. Out there you are a target. Here, under my absolute control, you are untouchable. Do not mistake my patience for weakness, Nyla. I will lock you in this penthouse for the rest of your life if it keeps you and the boy breathing. Then you will lose us both, she fired back, the raw honesty of her words slicing through his commanding facade. If you lock me away, you prove that I was right to run. You prove that you are only the monster I feared, incapable of anything but control. The accusation struck him, a subtle but undeniable blow to the dark armor he wore so proudly. The dangerous attraction between them flared, fueled by a heavy, emotional conflict. Nyla didn't just want to survive. She was demanding he evolve. She was demanding a step toward redemption he wasn't sure he was capable of. I spent 5 years scrubbing these floors, Nyla continued, stepping forward, daring to invade his space just as he had invaded hers. She tilted her chin up, her dark eyes flashing with brilliant, suppressed fire. I know every blind spot in your security. I know which of your lieutenants take bribes from the Russians, and which guards sleep on duty. You want to protect Adrian? You don't lock me away in a tower. You let me help you clean house. Min-Sung stared at her, the shock of her audacity quickly morphing into a profound, obsessive reverence. The power dynamic shifted, tectonic plates realigning beneath their feet. She was not asking for his permission. She was claiming her territory. Slowly a dark, devastating smile touched his lips. He reached out, his hand sliding not to pin her, but to interlock his fingers with hers. He recognized her challenge, and for the first time in his blood-soaked life, he realized the only way to keep her was to let her lead. The warmth of Min-Sung's interlocked fingers was a stark contrast to the cold, impending violence of his world. Nyla stared at their joined hands, the realization setting in that she had just forged a pact with the devil. But this time she held half the pitchfork. Before the fragile truce could fully settle, the heavy silence of the penthouse was shattered by the sharp, vibrating buzz of Min-Sung's encrypted phone. He didn't release her hand immediately. His thumb stroked her knuckles once, a fleeting possessive reassurance, before he answered the call. Speak, he commanded, his voice dropping back into the glacial baritone that made empires tremble. Nyla watched the micro-expressions on his face, the slight tightening of his jaw, the darkening of his obsidian eyes. The war had already breached their walls. The eastern perimeter, Min-Sung relayed, ending the call and snapping his gaze to Nyla. 3 of my loyalists were just found dead in the gardens. The word is out. The Russian syndicate knows about the boy. Nyla's blood ran cold. She pulled her hand from his, spinning toward the velvet sofa where Adrian slept, his small chest rising and falling in an oblivious, peaceful rhythm. Collateral damage. That was what the rival factions would call a 5-year-old child. To them, Adrian wasn't an innocent boy. He was a tactical vulnerability, a bleeding artery in the Kang Empire that they could slice open to watch Min-Sung bleed out. Who was on rotation at the eastern gate? Nyla asked. Her voice was eerily calm, the subservient maid vanishing entirely as the sharp, observant intelligence she had offered moments ago took the reins. Min-Sung narrowed his eyes, tracking her sudden shift in demeanor. Choi and his unit. Choi is on the Russian payroll, Nyla stated without hesitation, her dark eyes flashing with lethal certainty. I saw him taking duffel bags from an unmarked sedan 3 months ago by the service entrance. He deliberately left the security cameras looping to cover the handoff. A terrifying predatory shadow passed over Min-Sung's features. He wasn't just looking at the mother of his child anymore. He was looking at his most dangerous, underestimated weapon. Without breaking eye contact with her, he lifted the phone back to his ear, pressing a single speed dial button. Eradicate Choi's entire unit. Leave no one breathing. He hung up. The order was a death sentence, executed with the casual flick of a wrist. Nyla swallowed hard, her chest tight. This was the toxic reality of the war she had just stepped into. Blood would soon paint the marble floors she used to scrub, and it would be spilled on her intelligence. Min-Sung stepped up behind her, his broad chest lightly brushing her back as they both looked down at their sleeping son. You understand what this means, Nyla? He murmured, his breath warm against her ear. There is no more hiding. To keep him innocent, we must become the monsters. Nyla reached out, gently brushing a dark curl from Adrian's forehead. Her heart ached for the quiet life she had tried to give him, but the fierce, unyielding mother inside her knew the brutal truth. She leaned back slightly into Min-Sung's solid, unmovable frame. Then let them burn, she whispered. The distant, muffled crack of gunfire shattered the fragile peace of the penthouse. It wasn't the cinematic roar of a battlefield, but a precise, rhythmic popping that echoed through the sprawling Kang estate. Choi's unit was being eradicated. The blood Nyla had just sanctioned was already spilling onto the manicured lawns. A violent tremor racked her body. For a fractured, agonizing second, the ghost of the maid returned, screaming at her to grab Adrian, find the hidden servant's staircase, and vanish into the night. It was the deepest, most primal instinct she possessed, the conditioned terror that had kept them alive for 5 years. The urge to flee clawed at her throat, a physical, suffocating panic. This was her breaking point, the razor-thin line between the prey she had been and the predator she had to become. Min-Sung moved with terrifying, fluid efficiency. He strode to a mahogany bookshelf, pressing a hidden panel that revealed a sleek, biometric armory. As he loaded a matte black tactical pistol, his dark eyes cut across the room, locking onto her paralyzing internal war. He saw the frantic calculation in her gaze, the desperate look toward the heavy oak doors. He walked back to her, the weapon hanging loosely at his side. The lethal authority of the Mafia boss softened into something raw and incredibly dangerous. He reached out, his free hand cupping her face, his thumb smoothing over her racing pulse. The subterranean tunnels are still clear, Min-Sung murmured, his voice a dark, velvet temptation cutting through the distant chaos. My personal guard can escort you and the boy to a jet. You can run, Nyla. You can disappear again. She stared into the obsidian depths of his eyes. It was a test. A brutal offering of the very freedom she had spent half a decade praying for. But as she looked at him, feeling the intoxicating protective heat radiating from his towering frame, the illusion of escape finally shattered. Running meant constantly looking over her shoulder. Running meant Adrian would never truly be safe from the shadows. She glanced back at the sofa. Adrian shifted in his sleep, his small hand clutching a velvet pillow. If they fled, he would grow up a fugitive. If they stayed, he would grow up untouchable. Nyla slowly turned her gaze back to the man who commanded the city's underworld. She didn't pull away from his touch. Instead, she reached down, her trembling fingers wrapping around the cold, steel grip of the pistol in his hand. I'm done running, she whispered, her voice hardening into unbreakable steel as she pulled the weapon from his grip. Show me how to use it. A devastating, predatory smile curved Min-Sung's lips. The dangerous attraction between them ignited into a brilliant, consuming inferno. He didn't just have his heir back. He had found his queen. And together they were going to slaughter anyone who dared to knock on their door. The cold steel of the pistol felt foreign in Nyla's trembling hands, yet perfectly balanced. Min-Sung didn't laugh or dismiss her sudden bravado. Instead, his large hands covered hers, adjusting her grip with a deadly, intimate precision. The intoxicating heat of his chest pressed against her back as he guided her finger to the safety. To survive my world, Min-Sung murmured, his breath ghosting over her ear in the dimly lit penthouse. You must know exactly who stands behind you in the dark. The heavy oak doors suddenly swung open. Nyla's heart leaped to her throat, the pistol jerking up, but Min-Sung's hand firmly anchored her wrist. Standing in the threshold was Tae-jin, Min-Sung's shadow and most ruthless lieutenant. His bespoke suit was spattered with fresh blood, the violent aftermath of Choi's execution. Tae-jin's cold, assessing eyes bypassed his boss entirely, locking onto Nyla and the weapon she held. Lethal suspicion radiated from him. To the syndicate's inner circle, a lowly maid who could successfully hide in air for 5 years was a master of deception, making her the most dangerous and untrustworthy variable in the room. The eastern perimeter is secured, boss, Tae-jin reported, his voice a gravelly rasp. His hand rested dangerously close to his holstered weapon. But we have a blind spot in the western wing. The Russians knew our exact patrol routes. We have another mole and she, he gestured sharply toward Nyla, has been moving through this estate unseen for years. The accusation hung heavy in the air. A dark empire built on blood and betrayal left no room for blind faith. Min-Sung's jaw hardened, his primal instinct to violently protect his newfound queen warring with the pragmatic reality of his syndicate. But before the Mafia boss could unleash his wrath on his second-in-command, Nyla lowered the gun, stepping out from Min-Sung's protective shadow. It's not a mole in the guard rotation, Nyla stated, her voice projecting a calm, icy authority that surprised even her. She looked directly at the blood-soaked lieutenant, refusing to shrink under his glare. It's the housekeeping ledger. The head housekeeper, Mrs. Lim, adjusts the cleaning schedules around your security shifts. She's been passing the timetables to the Russian envoy hidden inside the weekly laundry delivery trucks. I saw the modified manifests 3 days ago. Tae-jin froze. The scattered puzzle pieces clicked into place behind his calculating eyes. The most invisible people in the sprawling estate were the ones holding the keys to its destruction. He looked from Nyla to Min-Sung, the hostile suspicion slowly dissolving into a profound, grudging respect. Min-Sung stepped up beside her, the devastating mix of pride and dark obsession burning in his obsidian gaze. She wasn't just surviving. She was actively dismantling the threats to his throne. Secure Mrs. Lim, Min-Sung ordered softly. Tae-jin offered a deep, unprecedented bow, not just to his boss, but to the brilliant woman standing beside him. As the lieutenant vanished back into the chaos, Min-Sung intertwined his fingers with Nyla's, cementing an unholy, unbreakable alliance in a world that thrived on treason. The metallic click of Min-Sung loading a secondary magazine cut through the heavy silence of the penthouse. Down below, the sprawling estate was rapidly transforming into a war zone. But inside their gilded fortress, a profound and dangerous shift was taking place. Nyla stood by the mahogany desk, the cold weight of the pistol in her hand acting as an anchor as the adrenaline spiked through her veins. The Russians are moving faster than anticipated, Min-Sung stated, his voice a glacial, unyielding baritone as he monitored the encrypted security feeds on his monitors. They are preparing to breach the western gardens. I will have Tae-jin funnel them into the hedgerow maze. My men will slaughter them there. It was the classic Kang Min-Sung strategy. Absolute, overwhelming brutality. But Nyla's mind, sharpened by 5 years of silent observation, raced ahead of the impending violence. She looked toward the velvet sofa where Adrian slept, blissful and unaware. No, Nyla said, stepping directly into Min-Sung's line of sight. A firefight in the gardens means a bloodbath right outside our walls. It means risking stray bullets and exposing your loyalists to unnecessary casualties. There is a cleaner way. Min-Sung paused, his dark, piercing eyes locking onto hers. The fact that he stopped to listen to her, rather than dismissing her or demanding obedience, spoke volumes. Mrs. Lim is still secured, correct? Nyla asked, her voice steadying into a lethal, calculating calm. Don't just execute her. Force her to send one final transmission to her handlers. Have her tell the Russian envoy that the estate is a decoy, and that you are quietly evacuating the air through the old smuggling tunnels toward the harbor. Min-Sung's jaw tightened as the brilliance of her trap unspooled in the charged air between them. The harbor is strictly controlled by the Triad, he murmured, his gaze darkening with a sudden intoxicating thrill. Exactly, Nyla breathed, stepping closer to his towering frame. If a heavily armed Russian strike force swarms the docks unannounced, the Triad will perceive it as an immediate act of war. You don't have to sacrifice your men tonight, Min-Sung. Let your enemies tear each other to pieces. For his entire life, Min-Sung's only answer to a threat had been his own personal, hands-on devastation. He had embraced the role of the monster because the underworld demanded it. But looking at Nyla, her fierce intellect weaponized to protect their family, he felt the first agonizing beautiful crack in his damned soul. He didn't want to be just a butcher anymore. He wanted to be a king worthy of the brilliant, ruthless woman standing before him. It was a dark, profound step toward a redemption he never knew he craved. He dropped the spare magazine onto the desk and closed the distance between them, his large hands gently framing her face. The dangerous heat of his touch was no longer just a display of control. It was a profound vow of partnership. "You are completely lethal," he whispered, his lips brushing against hers in a desperate, dark promise. "They came to destroy an empire tonight, but they have no idea they just crowned its queen." The command left Min-Sung's lips as a dark, irrevocable decree. He didn't hesitate, didn't second-guess the brilliant, lethal strategy she had just laid out before him. With a few clipped words in Korean into his encrypted phone, he redirected Tae-jin to execute Nyla's trap. The Russian strike force would be fed the false intel, lured directly into the slaughterhouse of the Triad's harbor. Nyla stood perfectly still, listening to the man who ruled the city's underworld pivot his entire war machine on her word alone. She looked down at the discarded white apron still resting on the plush carpet. For 5 years, that piece of fabric had been her shield and her prison. She had convinced herself that shrinking, bowing, and swallowing her terror was the only way to survive the monsters. She had accepted the role of the victim, believing that a maid could never outmaneuver a mafia king. But as Min-Sung ended the call and tossed the phone onto the mahogany desk, the final remnants of her fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, intoxicating clarity. The victim was dead. She had to be. A victim could only hide her son. A queen could build a fortress around him. Min-Sung stepped slowly toward her, the adrenaline of the impending bloodbath radiating from his towering frame. Yet his obsidian eyes were completely consumed by her. He reached out, his large hands sliding down her arms to softly encircle her wrists. He didn't pin them this time. He held them with a quiet, devastating reverence, tracing the pulse points that beat with a newfound, fearless rhythm. "They are diverting to the docks," he murmured, his voice a gravelly, intimate vibration in the quiet room. "You just dismantled a syndicate war without firing a single shot." "I stopped surviving and started playing the game," Nyla answered, her voice steady, stripped of the breathy submissiveness that had defined her for half a decade. She didn't look away from his intense, searching gaze. She didn't flinch from the darkness in him. Instead, she met it with her own. A profound, redemptive shift fractured the heavy air between them. Min-Sung had spent his life subjugating enemies and demanding absolute obedience, believing fear was his only currency. But staring at Nyla, he realized true loyalty wasn't commanded. It was earned by standing as equals. He didn't want to break her. He wanted to be the blade she wielded. He pulled her flesh against his chest, the hard muscle and steel of his holstered weapon pressing against her. Nyla leaned into the embrace, resting her hand over his racing heart. She was no longer the frightened girl who had run in the dead of night, nor the invisible maid scrubbing marble floors. She was the architect of their survival, a woman who had finally stepped out of the shadows to claim her dark throne. The heavy oak doors of the penthouse opened again. But this time the disruption wasn't an attack. Tae-jin hauled a trembling, bruised woman into the room, throwing her onto the plush carpet. Mrs. Lim, the head housekeeper. For 5 years she had barked orders at Nyla, treating the invisible maid with sharp disdain. Now she knelt before the mafia boss, sobbing, fully expecting the brutal, agonizing torture Kang Min-Sung was infamous for. Min-Sung stepped forward, the air around him dropping 10 degrees. He drew a sleek combat knife from his jacket, the metallic hiss a promise of slow, methodical pain. It was his default language, brute force to extract compliance. But before the blade could catch the chandelier's light, Nyla placed a gentle, steadying hand over his forearm. The touch was light, but it halted the most feared man in the city instantly. Min-Sung's obsidian eyes snapped to hers, questioning the interruption. Nyla didn't flinch. She stepped past him, leaving the safety of his towering shadow, her dark skin glowing under the warm ambient light, to kneel directly in front of the traitor. "Mrs. Lim," Nyla said, her voice completely devoid of the trembling maid she had once played. It was cold, analytical, and terrifyingly calm. "You have a daughter studying in London. The Russian envoy promised to pay her tuition in exchange for my son's schedule. Am I correct? The older woman gasped, her tear-streaked face snapping up in sheer horror. She stared at Nyla, realizing the quiet girl who scrubbed the floors had meticulously gathered every secret in the house. Min-Sung could carve the truth out of you, Nyla continued softly, the velvet threat mirroring the boss standing silently behind her. But if he does, the Russians will know you've been compromised. Your daughter will be their first target. They tie up loose ends, Mrs. Lim. You know this. A strangled sob tore from the housekeeper's throat. The realization hit her. She was dead either way, but her daughter's life hung in the balance. There is a phone on the desk, Nyla instructed, her intelligence weaving a flawless psychological trap that brute force never could. You will message your handler. You will tell them Kang Min-Sung panicked and is moving the boy through the harbor smuggling tunnels right now. If you make it convincing, the Triad will handle the Russians for us, and your daughter remains untouched. You have 30 seconds to decide her fate. Min-Sung watched the exchange, utterly captivated. He slipped the knife back into his jacket, a dark, devastating smirk curving his lips. He had built his empire on shattering bones, but Nyla was dismantling his enemies by shattering their minds. She had just secured a flawless victory without shedding a single drop of blood in his sanctuary. Mrs. Lim scrambled for the phone with shaking hands, frantically typing the deceptive message that would seal the Russians' doom. As the encrypted text sent, Min-Sung stepped up behind Nyla, his chest solid against her back. His lips brushed the shell of her ear, his breath hot with dark reverence. Remind me, he whispered, never to play a game of chess with you. The heavy oak doors clicked shut as Tae-jin dragged the weeping housekeeper out of the penthouse, leaving behind a profound, charged silence. The immediate threat was diverted, the trap successfully set. Nyla stood by the mahogany desk, her chest rising and falling in slow, measured breaths. The adrenaline that had fueled her brilliant, ruthless gambit was beginning to recede, leaving behind the stark reality of what she had just done. She had stepped fully into the bloody, calculated world she had spent 5 years running from. Min-Sung didn't move to pour a drink or check his encrypted feeds. His entire focus was anchored exclusively to her. He stepped into her space, moving with that slow, predatory grace that always made her pulse hammer. But the terrifying edge of absolute control was completely gone. In its place was a dark, consuming reverence. For 5 years, I tore this city apart looking for the woman who slipped through my fingers, he murmured, his voice a low velvet rumble that vibrated against her skin. He reached out, his large hands resting lightly on her waist, not pinning her but anchoring himself to her. I thought you were terrified. I thought I needed to find you to shield you from the monsters in my world. He leaned closer, his obsidian eyes burning with a fierce, unexpected vulnerability that no one in his syndicate had ever witnessed. But you were never the prey, Nyla. You were just waiting for the right moment to bare your teeth. I bared them for him, Nyla replied softly, glancing toward the velvet sofa where Adrian remained blissfully asleep. She turned her gaze back to the feared Mafia boss, refusing to lower her chin. I won't be a prisoner in this tower, Min-Sung. And I won't be a submissive shadow standing behind you, while you dictate our lives. If we do this, we do it together. I am not your maid, and I am not your captive. A devastating, triumphant smirk curved his lips. The dangerous attraction that had sparked their forbidden affair all those years ago flared into a brilliant, unbreakable inferno. He didn't want a captive. He had an empire full of people forced to bow. He wanted her exactly as she was, fierce, brilliant, and completely unyielding. No, Min-Sung agreed, his hand sliding up her back to tangle in her dark hair, pulling her flesh against his solid chest. His heartbeat thudded against hers in a violent, steady rhythm. You are my equal. The only person in this godforsaken world capable of standing beside me. His lips captured hers, completely erasing the ghost of the fearful maid. It wasn't a kiss of dominance, but a dark, desperate vow of partnership. They had started as master and servant, predator and prey, but in the crucible of a syndicate war, they had finally forged a lethal, unbreakable alliance. The encrypted phone on the mahogany desk buzzed, vibrating with the final verdict of the night's invisible war. Min-Sung didn't break his hold on Nyla. He simply reached out, answering the call on speaker so the victory could hang between them. Tae-jin's gravelly voice filled the dimly lit penthouse, laced with a heavy, unprecedented awe. The harbor is painted red, boss. The Triad decimated the Russian strike force the second they breached the docks. It was a massacre. We didn't lose a single man. Min-Sung's thumb stroked the line of Nyla's jaw, his obsidian eyes burning with a fierce possessive pride. He didn't look at the phone. He looked only at the woman who had just checkmated his greatest enemy without lifting a blade. Clean up the estate, Min-Sung commanded softly, and assemble the inner circle in the grand hall. It is time they formally meet the architect of their survival. He ended the call, returning the room to silence. But it was no longer a silence heavy with impending violence. It was thick with the intoxicating gravity of absolute victory. Min-Sung stepped back, offering his hand. Nyla looked at his outstretched palm. A hand that had ordered countless deaths, yet now offered her half of his dark, sprawling kingdom. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, her grip just as firm, just as unyielding. When they descended the sweeping marble staircase together, the grand hall was lined with the most dangerous men in the syndicate. These were the same lieutenants who, mere hours ago, had walked past her as if she were a ghost in a cotton uniform. Now, as she walked beside Kang Min-Sung, stripped of her subservient facade and cloaked in the untouchable authority of his equal, every head bowed in profound, silent submission. Tae-jin stepped forward, his cold eyes lowering respectfully. There was no questioning her place. She had outsmarted their enemies and saved their lives using nothing but her mind. Anyone who breathes a word of my son, or disrespects the queen of this syndicate, will not answer to me. They will answer to her. Min-Sung's baritone voice echoed off the marble, a lethal decree that permanently cemented her power. He didn't just claim her. He weaponized her brilliance, seamlessly merging his brute force with her flawless strategy. Justice for her years of hiding would be exacted not through fear, but through absolute sovereign rule. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, dawn finally broke, casting a pale golden light over the city they now controlled together. Adrian stirred on the velvet sofa, his dark eyes fluttering open. He looked up, no longer a dangerous secret forced into the shadows, but an heir flanked by parents who would gladly burn the world to keep him warm. Min-Sung lifted the boy into his arms, resting his free hand on the small of Nyla's back, pulling her close. The dangerous attraction, the past betrayals, and the terrifying power imbalances had all been forged into a dark, unbreakable devotion. Nyla leaned against Min-Sung's solid frame, watching the city wake below them. She had scrubbed its floors to survive, but now, standing side by side with the devil himself, she owned it all.